lot changed for horror films in 1960. All because of Marion Crane. What did she do, you ask? Well, she took a shower. The shower scene from Psycho is one of the most important moments in horror cinema history. Much has been written about it and about what it means. No wonder, it is a brilliant scene. Janet Leigh is terrific in it. And then there's Alfred Hitchcock. He is one of the most celebrated and captivating filmmakers of cinema history. What Leigh, Hitchcock, and screenwriter Joseph Stefano did with Psycho was remarkable, entirely subverting audience expectations. You just didn't kill the heroine halfway through a film. It wasn't done. Another thing not usually done was mixing the horror and thriller genres. Usually, a film was either one or the other. Psycho, however, was both. Traditionally, a thriller was a film in which the plot was driven by suspense and excitement, while a horror film aimed to shock and horrify its audience. Of course, there are no rules that say a horror film can't be suspense and excitement driven. And there is no rule that says a thriller can't shock and horrify you.
Look, I tell you, I can't do it.
In short, genre is difficult to define. When Michael Jackson did his famous music video for Thriller, directed by John Landis, the video had a horror motif. As a kid, I was always confused by this. For me, thrillers were films like Rear Window, and Panic in the Streets, and The French Connection. Horror were films like Frankenstein, and The Shining, and Fright Night. But we humans have a need to categorize things. Things are either blue or green. Turquoise confuses us. Humans are either male or female. Transgender people mystify us. And a film is either one genre or another. Of course, life is far more complicated, and that is what makes colors interesting, people fascinating, and films transformative. So, keeping this in mind, let's explore the border between thriller and horror cinema. In the days before Marion Crane showered, the two genres were easier to separate. This early Hitchcock film, The 39 Steps, is probably in my top 10 films of all time. It is a stylish thriller with a charming comedic touch. It absolutely does not belong in the horror genre. But despite not being a horror film, look at the cinematic language in this sequence. Note the resemblance to German Expressionism and German horror cinema of the 1920s. Hitchcock made a couple of films in Germany early in his career. During that period, he frequented the set for F.W. Murnau's The Last Laugh. That experience marked him, and many of Murnau's cinematic techniques show up in Hitchcock's films. Hitchcock also cited Fritz Lang's dark fantasy film, Destiny, as an influence on his craft and his career. That being said, far from every German Expressionist film was a horror film. Expressionism defied genre. For instance, Metropolis is a science fiction film. These small Expressionist moments in the 39 Steps do not make it horror. They are merely stylistic touches, and not at all something that categorizes the film as a genre hybrid between thriller and horror. Not even a little. A bit harder to categorize is The Lodger, a story of the London fog. This early Hitchcock thriller dealt with a serial killer roaming the foggy streets of the British capital. It is clearly a play on Jack the Ripper, who despite being a real historical figure, has had a major influence on fictional horror cinema. However, the story of The Lodger focuses less on the Ripper, here called The Avenger. Instead, the film goes with that favorite Hitchcock narrative of the wrong man, with the lodger finding himself suspected of murders he didn't commit. Plot-wise, it is a clear thriller, not a horror film. Had Hitchcock made it later in his career, it would perhaps have straddled the genres a bit more, like Psycho or Frenzy did. A bit harder to define are a trio of films that came out in the late 1940s. They all feature the visual language of horror cinema, though they are generally considered to be thrillers. Perhaps they can help us define the border between the thriller and the horror film. The Beast with Five Fingers and The Spiral Staircase are both included in one of my favorite film books of all time, the Aurum Encyclopedia of Horror. The third film, Sorry Wrong Number, is not included. Let's take a closer look at each film and see if we agree with Aurum editor Phil Hardy. The Beast with Five Fingers is both a mystery film and a horror film. It starts with a murder, and then there's the matter of an inheritance, and a questionable last will and testament. That sounds like a fairly typical mystery plot to me. Oh, aside from this disembodied hand crawling around, strangling people, and playing the piano. The cinematic language is more horror than thriller, but despite this, the main drive of the plot is the mystery aspect. No prizes for guessing who the bad guy is. The ending, where the disembodied hand is revealed to be a figment of the murderer's imagination, also supports a thriller narrative.
He's playing again.
The ending explanation pulls the film away from horror and back into thriller territory. Though according to the Aurum Film Encyclopedia, the ending of The Beast with Five Fingers was originally supposed to be more ambiguous, allowing audiences to decide for themselves if the killer disembodied hand was real, or if Peter Lorre was nuts and seeing things. Apparently the studio wanted a more clear-cut solution. Still, madness and terror weigh heavy on The Beast with Five Fingers, firmly making the case that the film is equal parts horror and mystery. Side note, in case you are curious, cartoonist Charles Addams did not steal his comic strip creation Thing from this film. The Addams Family cartoon strip started in 1938, 8 years prior to this film being released. And neither did The Beast with Five Fingers steal from Charles Addams. Thing was first conceived as a creature too terrible to behold. It was drawn as a hard-to-spot entity watching the family, usually from somewhere hidden. Note top right and top left in these cartoon strips. Then, when the Addams Family became a 1960s sitcom, Thing evolved into a creature who, again, was too terrible to behold, so only his hand was visible, usually reaching out from mailboxes, hidey holes, and flower plots. It was only in the 1991 horror comedy The Addams Family that Thing became a disembodied hand, akin to the titular Beast with Five Fingers. As for our second 1940s sample, The Spiral Staircase tells the story of a psychosomatically mute girl, played by Dorothy McGuire. Her life is in danger, threatened by a mysterious serial killer targeting women. Here, the cinematic language is more haunted compared to your average 1940s era thriller. The subject of fear plays a major role in the plot, and the lead character is a troubled young woman, like we've since seen in so many horror films. She struggles with personal issues and has to overcome that barrier, again, like in so many horror films. But when the Aurum Film Encyclopedia described The Spiral Staircase, they talked about it as a thriller, even though it was listed in a book about horror films. So what is it? Horror? Thriller? Perhaps a bit of both? For the sake of sanity, let's say it's 2/3 thriller and 1/3 horror. Of our 3 late 1940s samples, I really understand why Sorry Wrong Number is not included in the horror category.
Oh, hello? Who is this?
Barbara Stanwyck plays a bedridden woman who through crossed telephone wires overhears 2 men planning a murder, and she eventually realizes the intended victim is her. Stylistically, Sorry Wrong Number is more film noir than horror. Despite this, there are trace elements of the horror genre, like the internal mental struggles of its lead female character, her psychosomatic heart condition, and, oh yeah, the dark ending. Still, chalk those up to film noir rather than horror. With these 3 films as notable exceptions, horror and thriller cinema remained far apart for a few more years. But the line was again towed in 1955 by French filmmaker Henri-Georges Clouzot when he made the excellent thriller Les Diaboliques. The film is about a wife and mistress colluding to kill the man making both their lives miserable. The wife, who has a heart condition, real this time, begins to see traces of the husband she thought she helped kill. The film excellently combined thriller and horror elements. In many ways, it helped further tie the bond between the horror film and the thriller, demonstrating that the two genres are closely related, often overlapping, and sometimes quite hard to separate from each other. Interestingly, the film is not included in the Aurum Film Encyclopedia of Horror. 5 years after the original Les Diaboliques, Psycho followed, and shattered what remained of the divide between the genres. Or so you would think. For some, Psycho is more thriller than horror. I've heard arguments go that way, but I wonder if that is because people are afraid of the stigma of horror films. There seems to be some cockamamie notion that thrillers are superior to horror films because, again, we are human and we categorize and rank stuff in order to understand it. Where then does the border between horror and thriller lie? Several films followed Psycho, making the question increasingly hard to answer. Cape Fear was an intense thriller about darkness, revenge, and obsession, and Whatever Happened to Baby Jane revealed the horrifying toxic relationship between two women, delving into the fractured psyches of his two lead characters. Baby Jane was included in the Aurum Film Encyclopedia of Horror. Cape Fear was not. But the 1991 Cape Fear remake by Martin Scorsese was included. It's enough to give you a headache. So how do we separate thriller and horror? Over the next 5 decades, several heart-pounding films made the question practically unanswerable. When I started writing the script for this episode, I was sure I would be able to answer the question definitively. I cockily assumed that I'd be able to give you a clean, decisive conclusion. But the truth is, I don't exactly know where the border is between the thriller and the horror film. I think perhaps that it is a question that needs to be asked of each individual film, like I already did with the 39 Steps, The Lodger, The Beast with 5 Fingers, The Spiral Staircase, Sorry Wrong Number, Les Diaboliques, and Psycho. But should that be my goal? Should I have to define the absolute point where the thriller and the horror film intersect? For that matter, should we define exactly how green or how blue turquoise is? Or how male or female a transgender person is? I think it is better to leave it alone, and to just accept that some things are unique for a reason. But if you absolutely want an answer to these questions, here we go. Turquoise is more green in my eyes. Transgender people are whatever they feel they are, and it's none of my damn business to say otherwise. And the films? Well, here I am an authority. I've got this. The Tenant is a thriller. Basic Instinct is also a thriller, but one that has been seduced by horror cinema. The Silence of the Lambs is a horror film pretending to be a thriller. I guess Gone Girl is a thriller. Maybe I'm wrong. American Psycho is a social critique horror. I suppose. Okay, this is easier. Frailty is a thriller about a man forcing his kids to join him in killing people. Oh yeah, and all that apocalyptic stuff happens. Okay, fine, I'm changing my mind, it's a horror film. Martin Scorsese traditionally makes thrillers and crime films, so it follows that... Nope. Oh, bother it. Heck if I know what Shutter Island is supposed to be. It's a good film, but what the hell is it? Sometimes I wish Marion Crane would just have dealt with greasy hair, cause I can't answer these questions definitively. And you know what? Screw it. Let the borders be fluid. The films can be whatever the hell they want to be, and I'll still love watching them. My name is Wolf Craft, and this is History of Horror. If you have enjoyed this episode, please like, share, and subscribe. Join me next time for episode 5, The Exorcist, regarding priests, possessions, and pea soup. If you're interested in checking out more of my work, I'm also an author. My new science fiction novel, God of Desolation, is available on Amazon. Thanks a plenty!